Imagine this. You pour your heart into a tiny, furry life. You give it warmth, food, the safety of your walls. You learn the exact timbre of its purr, the weight of it settling on your feet at night. Then one ordinary Tuesday, it's just gone. Vanished. As if it never existed outside the ache it left behind. That is the sound a heart makes when it cracks open and waits. It was early November in the small, rain-lashed town of Cedar Brook. The kind of damp that seeped into your bones long before it ever touched your skin. The sky hung low and bruised, a perpetual twilight at 3 in the afternoon. Maple leaves, once fiery, were now slick, brown ghosts plastered to the sidewalks. Skeletal branches clawed at the gray. And the air, it smelled of wet earth, wood smoke clinging stubbornly from morning chimneys, and the faint, metallic tang of coming frost. Inside the small, slightly too quiet cottage on Elm Street, the radiators hissed, their warmth fighting a losing battle against the chill radiating from the single-pane windows. Maya sat at the scarred oak kitchen table, a mug of tea gone cold between her hands. She wasn't really looking at anything, just tracing the whorls in the wood grain. A map to nowhere. 3 months. 3 months since the moving truck had groaned away, leaving her alone in this house filled with someone else's memories, and the crushing silence of her own. Her mother's house. Empty now. Not just of furniture, but of her. The vibrant, stubborn woman who'd filled every corner with laughter, orchestrated chaos, and a fierce, enveloping love, had been quietly erased by something small and relentless within her own lungs. 6 weeks. That's all it took, from diagnosis to goodbye, leaving Maya adrift at 32. Her own life in the city, the demanding job, the fading relationship, the constant hum, suddenly felt like a poorly fitting suit. Coming here, sifting through her mother's life, felt like the only possible next step. A step into a thick, suffocating fog of grief, and a loneliness so profound it echoed. She'd named him Jasper, not for any grand reason, to just fit. He'd appeared one evening, just as the last sliver of sun bled out behind the pines at the edge of the overgrown backyard. Maya had been wrestling with a stubborn kitchen drawer, frustration a tight knot in her chest, when she sensed presence. Turned, and there he was, sitting perfectly still on the mossy back step, just beyond the rectangle of yellow light spilling from the open door. He wasn't a kitten, not young, lean but not starved, with fur the deep, shifting gray of storm clouds shadowing mountains. Wiry, touched with faint, darker stripes like charcoal smudges. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Large, luminous, a startling ancient gold, like liquid amber held up to the fading light. They held no fear, just a profound, unsettling stillness. A quiet assessment. He didn't meow, didn't twitch, just watched her. Maya, her own grief a raw, open wound, felt an immediate, almost painful kinship with that stillness. She moved slowly, deliberately, filled a chipped saucer with the leftover tuna from her own sad sandwich supper, and placed it just inside the door, on the worn linoleum. Then she stepped back, leaning against the counter, watching. He waited. Long minutes stretched, filled only by the hiss of the radiator, and the steady drip, drip, drip from the leaky gutter outside. Then, with unhurried grace, he rose, padded silently over the threshold, his movements fluid, economical. Not ravenously, but with a quiet focus, every movement precise. When he finished, He meticulously cleaned his whiskers, one careful paw drawn over his face. Those golden eyes lifted, locked onto hers again. A silent acknowledgement, a transaction completed. He didn't stay that night. He simply turned, melted back into the damp twilight, leaving only the empty saucer and a faint scent of wet fur and wild air. He came back the next evening, and the next, always at that liminal hour, just as dusk bled into dark. Maya began to expect him, to listen for the subtle shift in the silence outside that signaled his arrival. She'd open the door, place the food, step back. He'd enter, clean himself, and leave. No sound, just that profound, golden gaze meeting hers before he vanished. She started noticing details. The way the fur on his left cheek was slightly shorter, paler, a thin, faded scar running through it like a misplaced seam. The way one ear had a tiny, precise notch missing from the tip, a badge from battles she couldn't imagine. Still, long and expressive, would flick just once, a slow, deliberate metronome beat, as he finished eating, as if signaling his imminent departure. She talked to him, softly, nonsense mostly, about the stubborn drawer, the leaky faucet in the bathroom, the endless boxes of her mother's things, still stacked in the small, unused dining room. I found her recipe box today. Remember how she'd pretend she needed it, but really she knew every cake, every stew by heart? Just like the ritual of it, her voice would catch, thicken. He'd pause in his meticulous cleaning, those ancient gold eyes lifting, holding hers for a beat longer than usual, not judging, just an anchor in the swirling tide of her grief. One rain-lashed night, wind howling around the corners of the little house. He didn't just eat and leave. He lingered. After finishing, he walked a slow circuit of the small kitchen, padding silently past the table, past the humming refrigerator, his nose twitching slightly at the unfamiliar scents trapped within the walls. He paused by the closed door to the dining room, the room stacked high with boxes and fragments of a life ended. His head tilted, just slightly, ears swiveling forward. She stood there, utterly still, for a long moment, then turned, walked back towards the back door, but instead of leaving immediately, he sat down, right on the worn mat inside the door, facing the kitchen, facing her. He tucked his paws neatly beneath him, that long, gray tail curling around his body like a comma. He didn't look at her. He just sat, present. Maya held her breath. This was new. This felt significant. Not affection, not yet, but a tentative, unspoken ceasefire. A shared space in the quiet. The storm battered the windows. The radiator hissed its futile protest. But inside, in the small pool of light cast by the single bulb over the sink, there was a fragile, trembling kind of peace. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the slow rise and fall of his breath, the faint twitch of his scarred cheek as he listened to the wind. He stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, a small, gray statue radiating quietude. With that same unhurried grace, he rose, stretched, one long, deliberate extension of spine and leg, his claws clicking softly on the linoleum. He looked at her then, one last, lingering gaze from those impossible gold eyes, a look that seemed to hold understanding, or just the simple acknowledgement of shared shelter from the storm. He nudged the door open with his head, just wide enough, and slipped back into the roaring dark. Maya stood there, long after the door had swung shut, The cold air he'd let in swirled around her ankles. But inside her chest, something else stirred. Something small, fragile as a new leaf, unfurling in the damp, grief-choked soil of her heart. It wasn't happiness, not relief. It was quieter than that. A shift, a minuscule realignment, the faintest glimmer, not of forgetting, but of a different way to be with the remembering. The silence of the house, still vast, still echoing, just slightly less empty. The ache was still there, constant companion, but beside it, curled up on the mat inside the door of her awareness, was a new presence, a quiet, gray, watchful presence. Something had begun, something wordless and profound, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, like the November chill, that this cat, this Jasper, wasn't just passing through. He was, in his own silent, scarred way, arriving, and her world, fractured as it was, had just grown a fraction larger and infinitely more mysterious. She took a breath, shaky, the first one that hadn't felt like swallowing glass in a very long time. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the quiet had changed. It held possibility. The gray light of a Cedar Brook dawn filtered through the kitchen window, painting everything in shades of pearl and ash. Maya stood at the sink, watching her breath fog the cold glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly silent. No birdsong yet, just the drip, drip of water falling from the eaves, a slow, melancholic percussion. She glanced towards the worn mat by the back door, empty. But the memory of Jasper sitting there, a small, contained island of calm in the night's chaos, lingered. It felt like a promise, whispered in a language she didn't quite understand, but desperately wanted to believe. The ritual continued. The back step, the chipped saucer, Jasper materializing from the gathering shadows like smoke given form. He'd enter, eat with that same quiet precision, clean his scarred face with fastidious care. But now, he lingered. Not every night, but more often than not. He began exploring, venturing beyond the kitchen's threshold, into the small, dimly lit living room. Maya would sit on the lumpy, floral-patterned sofa her mother had loved, a book unopened in her lap, or simply staring at the empty fireplace, and she'd feel him, a shift in the air, a whisper of movement on the worn braided rug. She'd turn her head, slowly, and find him sitting a few feet away, those ancient gold eyes fixed not on her, but on the cold hearth, or the rain-streaked window, or the dust motes dancing in a shaft of lamplight. He was studying the house, absorbing its stillness, its secrets, its sorrow. She learned his silences, the deep, contemplative stillness when he was simply being, and the alert, almost electric tension when something outside caught his attention, a rustle in the bushes, the distant yowl of another cat, the creak of an old tree limb. His ears would swivel, radar dishes tuning into frequencies only he could hear. His body would coil, just slightly, ready for flight or fight. It was a reminder. This creature of quiet dignity carried his own history of survival. The scar on his cheek, the notch in his ear, they weren't just marks. They were chapters. Maya started talking more, not just about the house or the weather, but about her. Mom loved this rug, she'd murmur one evening, watching Jasper carefully sniff its faded threads. She brought it back from Morocco decades ago, said it felt like walking on sunshine. Her voice would thicken, the familiar ache swelling behind her ribs. Jasper would pause in his investigation, his head lifting. He wouldn't look at her, not directly, but his ears would angle slightly towards her voice, the tip of his tail giving the faintest, almost imperceptible twitch. It wasn't sympathy, not in the human sense. It felt more like acknowledgement, simple recognition of sound, a feeling, vibrating in the shared air. One particularly raw afternoon, the sky the color of wet cement, Maya had been wrestling with a box labeled Linens, Guest Room, in her mother's looping script. The sight, beneath yellowed pillowcases, she found a small crochet blanket, baby blue, soft as dandelion fluff. Her own baby blanket, scent faintly of lavender and something indefinably old, hit her like a physical blow. She sank to the floor of the dining room. Amidst the towers of boxes, the blanket clutched to her chest, a sob tearing loose from somewhere deep and primal. The grief, so carefully contained in the routines of unpacking and cleaning, flooded her. She wept, shoulders shaking, face buried in the soft wool, drowning in the sheer, unbearable absence. She didn't hear him approach. She felt it, a subtle displacement of air near her knee. She lifted her head, tears blurring her vision, and there he was, Jasper, standing barely a foot away, in the doorway of the dining room he usually avoided. He wasn't looking at the boxes. He was looking at her. His golden eyes, usually so distant, so assessing, held a different quality. Not pity, but a deep, unnerving stillness. A watchfulness that felt ancient, knowing. He didn't come closer, didn't meow. He simply stood, a small, gray sentinel, his gaze unwavering, his presence solid. In the midst of her dissolving world was an anchor. He held her gaze, and in that silent exchange, Maya felt a sliver of the crushing loneliness. Retreat. Just a fraction. Just enough to let her draw a ragged, shuddering breath. He remained there, perfectly still, until her tears subsided to shaky hiccups. Then, without a sound, turned and padded silently back towards the kitchen, leaving her sitting on the floor, holding the baby blanket, the ghost of his presence, a tangible warmth against her skin. The seasons deepened. November bled into December, bringing biting winds and the first hesitant flurries of snow that melted as soon as they touched the ground. The cottage felt even smaller, colder, but the space within it, the space shared between woman and cat, had begun to expand, to warm. Jasper's explorations grew bolder. He'd follow her into the living room, not always sitting near, but finding his own spots. A patch of weak winter sun slanting through the front window, the corner behind the armchair, the top of the bookshelf, a vantage point from which he could observe the entire room with regal detachment. He started exhibiting small, quirky behaviors, a particular fascination with the tassels on the living room rug, which he'd bat at with lightning-fast paws when he thought she wasn't looking. A low, rumbling chirp he'd emit when she opened a can of tuna, a sound that vibrated with pure, uncomplicated anticipation. And the slow blink. Maya discovered the slow blink by accident. She'd been watching him one evening, curled into a tight gray comma on the braided rug, his eyes half closed, purring, a sound like a tiny, contented motor. She'd smiled, a real smile, the first one that hadn't felt forced in months. "Comfy, huh?" she'd whispered. He'd opened his eyes fully, those luminous gold pools, and held her gaze. Then, deliberately, slowly, He closed his eyes, held them closed for a beat, and opened them again. It wasn't a sleepy blink. It was deliberate, meaningful. She'd read about it once. A cat's "I love you," a sign of trust. Her breath hitched. She tentatively, hesitantly, blinked back, slowly, deliberately. He watched her, then did it again. A silent conversation, richer than any words. It became their language. A quiet, "I see you. I'm here. You're safe." She learned his textures. The way his fur felt when she finally, tentatively, reached out a hand as he passed by. Not to pet him, just to let her fingers brush lightly against his flank. It was unexpectedly coarse, like dense velvet over steel springs, warm from the radiator nearby. He hadn't flinched, hadn't sped up, just continued his unhurried pace. Though his tail had lifted, just a fraction, the tip curling slightly, a sign, she dared to hope, of acceptance. Not pleasure, not yet, but tolerance. A monumental step. The sensory world of their shared existence deepened. The smell of wet fur and cold earth when he came in from a snowy patrol, mingling with the scent of the chamomile tea Maya drank to soothe her frayed nerves. The sound of his sandpaper tongue rasping over his scarred flank during his meticulous grooming sessions. A counterpoint to the crackle of logs she finally dared to light in the small fireplace. The soft thud of his body landing on the rug after a leap. The rhythmic vibration of his purr. A physical hum she could feel in her own chest when she sat near him. The visual poetry of his stillness. A gray statue against the faded floral sofa. Watching snowflakes drift past the windowpane. He started claiming spaces closer to her. Instead of the far corner of the rug, he'd curl up nearer to the sofa. One bitterly cold night, wind whistling like a lost soul around the eaves, she found him asleep, truly asleep, not just resting, on the thick, knitted throw draped over the armchair next to the fireplace. He was curled tightly, his nose tucked under his tail, a perfect gray circle of fur. His breathing was deep, even, the rise and fall of his sides mesmerizingly slow. The firelight painted warm highlights on his fur, gilded the edges of his scar. Maya watched him, a lump forming in her throat. This wild creature, this survivor, felt safe enough here, with her, in this house of grief. To sleep so deeply, it felt like a gift, a fragile, precious thing. One evening, a week later, the air inside the cottage was still, hushed. Snow was falling steadily outside, muffling the world in a thick, white blanket. Maya was lying on the sofa, exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally drained from another day of sorting through her mother's papers. Bills, greeting cards, photographs that were daggers to the heart. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, seeking refuge in the darkness behind her lids. The fire crackled softly. The only sound. She didn't hear him jump up. She felt the dip in the old cushions near her feet. She kept her eyes closed, not daring to move. She felt the subtle vibrations as he walked, with infinite care, up the length of the sofa, alongside her leg, past her hip, stopping. Finally, near her shoulder, she could feel the warmth radiating from his small body. She could hear the soft whisper of his breath. He settled, not touching her, but close. So close. She lay perfectly still, her own breath shallow. This was unprecedented. He'd never come this near while she was lying down, vulnerable. Was he just seeking warmth? The fire's heat? She felt it. The lightest, most tentative. Not his body. A single paw. He extended it, just slightly, and placed it, with infinite delicacy, on her upper arm, just below the curve of her shoulder. The pads of his paws were surprisingly soft, slightly rough. The pressure was feather-light, almost hesitant, but it was there, undeniable. Maya's eyes flew open, turned her head, slowly, meeting his gaze. He was looking directly at her, those ancient gold eyes wide, unblinking. There was no fear in them, no demand, just a profound, searching question. His paw didn't move. It rested on her arm, a small weight, point of connection, thrumming with a quiet, electric warmth that spread through her entire body. She didn't breathe. She didn't dare. This small, deliberate touch felt like a seismic shift, a bridge built, not of words, or food, or convenience, but of something far more fundamental. Understanding, a silent communion in the fire-lit dark. So, the snow continued to fall, silencing the world. On the worn floral sofa, amidst the lingering ghosts and the scent of wood smoke, a woman held captive by grief, and a scarred cat shaped by survival, met across a distance measured in inches, but spanned by something immeasurable. His paw on her arm, a quiet anchor, in the vast, silent sea of their shared solitude. He held her gaze, and in the flickering firelight, Maya saw something new reflected in those golden depths. Not just watchfulness, not just ancient knowing, but a fragile, trembling seed of belonging. It mirrored the fragile thing unfurling in her own wounded heart. They stayed like that, frozen in the moment, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire, and the synchronized rhythm of their breathing, slowly, beginning to align. The fragile piece woven through the winter months, a tapestry of slow blinks, shared silences, and the anchoring warmth of a small gray body nearby, began to fray at the edges, almost imperceptibly at first, like the first hairline crack in thin ice. It started with the dining room, the room Jasper had always avoided, the repository of boxes, ghosts, and Maya's own unspoken dread. He'd paused by its closed door that stormy night, but now his behavior shifted. Persistently, he began lingering in the hallway outside it, not exploring, just sitting, staring at the plain, white-painted door, his body unnervingly still, his tail wrapped tightly around his paws. His golden eyes, usually so observant of the wider world, would fixate on the brass doorknob, or the strip of shadow beneath the door, with an intensity that felt ominous. It wasn't curiosity. It was vigilance, a silent, focused watchfulness that sent an unexpected chill down Maya's spine. One gray afternoon, while Maya sorted socks in her bedroom, she heard it, a sound utterly alien to Jasper's usual repertoire of silence and soft chirps. A low, guttural, almost pained growl. It vibrated through the thin walls, a sound of pure, primal unease. Her blood ran cold. She crept to her doorway, peering down the short hall towards the dining room door. Jasper was there, not sitting, but standing stiff-legged, his back arched, fur slightly bristled along his spine. He was facing the door, his head low, ears pinned flat against his skull. That low, rumbling growl, like stones grinding deep underground, pulsed from his chest. Feral, threatened. "Jasper?" Maya whispered, her voice shaky. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her. His entire being was focused on the barrier before him, as if something terrible, something unseen, lay coiled behind it. The growl deepened, then cut off abruptly. He gave one sharp, explosive hiss, a sound like tearing canvas, spun around, and streaked past her into the living room, vanishing behind the sofa. Maya stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The hallway felt suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. She stared at the innocuous white door, now imbued with a sinister weight by Jasper's reaction. What was in there? Just boxes. Her mother's clothes, trinkets, things she hadn't possessed the emotional strength to confront properly. Things steeped in memory, for surely not threat. Jasper, this creature who had navigated the wild, weathered storms, bore the marks of survival, was terrified. Terrified of a closed door in a quiet house. The incidents escalated. He began scratching, not at the door to get in, but at the baseboards outside the door. Late at night, when the house was its quietest, Maya would be jolted awake by the sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Persistent, rhythmic, almost frantic. Not the casual scratch of a cat stretching or marking, but a focused, deliberate digging, as if he was trying to tunnel under the barrier or unearth something buried beneath the floorboards. She'd pad out, heart racing, to find him hunched low, claws working furiously at the worn wood, there's flat, emitting that low, continuous growl. The moment the hall light flickered on, you freeze, look up at her with wild, dilated eyes, then bolt into the darkness, leaving behind faint gouges in the paint and a palpable residue of fear. Maya's own anxiety began to coil tight within her. The dining room, once just a painful chore, became a source of dread. Every time she approached it, keys jingling in her hand, she felt Jasper's gaze, heavy and watchful, from wherever he was hiding. The air around the door felt thick, resistant. Opening it felt like disturbing a grave. Nothing seemed amiss. The same towers of cardboard, the faint scent of cedar and dust and forgotten lavender sachets. The same sideboard against the far wall, its dark wood scratched and nicked, its brass handles tarnished. She'd force herself to open a box, sort a few items, her movements jerky, ears straining for any sound from Jasper outside. He never entered, but she could feel him, a coiled spring of tension just beyond the threshold. One evening, driven by a mix of frustration and burgeoning fear, Maya decided to confront it. She needed to reclaim the space, for her own sanity, and for Jasper's apparent peace. She carried a steaming mug of tea into the dining room, a feeble talisman against the gloom. She didn't close the door behind her, leaving it slightly ajar. Concession, or an escape route. She pulled a box labeled Kitchen Miscellaneous towards her, its contents spilling out onto the dusty floorboards, mismatched mugs, a chipped gravy boat, a wooden salad spoon worn smooth. Ordinary things, yet each one a tiny detonation in her chest. She worked mechanically, trying to ignore the oppressive silence, the feeling of being watched. She sensed him, a shadow in the crack of the doorway. Jasper. He hadn't crossed the threshold, but he was closer than he'd ever voluntarily been. He sat just outside, his body rigid, his gaze fixed, not on her, but on the old sideboard against the wall. Specifically, on the lowest drawer, the one that was always slightly crooked, that had always stuck. that Maya had never managed to open. She'd assumed it was warped, or locked without a key long lost. Jasper stared at it, utterly focused. His tail twitched, a sharp, agitated flick. He did something extraordinary. He lifted a paw, not to scratch the floor, but pointed it, deliberately, towards that stubborn drawer. He held it there for a moment, his golden eyes wide, unblinking, flicking from the drawer to her, and back again, a silent, urgent indication. Maya's breath caught. The gesture was so deliberate, so utterly unlike any cat behavior she'd ever witnessed. It wasn't random batting. It was communication. Primitive, desperate, but unmistakable. Look there. That. Pay attention. A cold prickle ran over her scalp. What was in that drawer? Why did it hold such power over him? Over the atmosphere of the room itself? Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Maya set her mug down. She walked slowly towards the sideboard, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the quiet. Jasper remained frozen in the doorway, a silent sentinel. She knelt before the stubborn drawer, running her fingers over its warped wood, the tarnished brass pull. She tugged. Nothing. It didn't budge. She tugged harder, wiggling it. A faint rattle, but no movement. But it had to be locked. But why lock a drawer in a dining room sideboard? What could possibly be inside that warranted a lock and elicited such terror from a cat? She examined the keyhole. Small, old-fashioned. No key. She hadn't found any stray keys in her sorting, though she hadn't been looking for one. Her mother hadn't been one for locks, especially inside her own home. Trust, openness, that had been her way. This felt strong, out of character. A secret. Maya sat back on her heels, staring at the drawer. The smooth, dark wood. The stubborn brass pull. The tiny, accusing keyhole. Jasper's low growl started again. A soft, continuous vibration from the doorway. Not directed at her, but at the sideboard, at the drawer. A warning rumble. Suddenly, the ordinary room felt charged, claustrophobic. The boxes loomed like tombstones. The dust motes danced in the weak light like agitated spirits. The locked drawer pulsed with a silent, malevolent energy. It wasn't just a stuck drawer anymore. It was a vault. A container for something her mother had deliberately hidden. Something Jasper, with his ancient, fearful eyes, knew was there. Something that had haunted the edges of this room, and now was demanding to be seen. Maya's initial grief, that vast, aching emptiness, was now overlaid with a sharp, chilling thread of fear and confusion. What connection could there possibly be between her gentle, open-hearted mother, a locked drawer, and a scarred, stray cat's abject terror? The quiet companionship, the fragile trust built over shared silences and slow blinks, felt fragile, threatened. Jasper wasn't just a comfort anymore. He was a harbinger, a silent guide pointing towards a mystery buried in her mother's past. A mystery that, judging by his reaction, wasn't safe. The peace of the winter cottage was shattered, replaced by a low thrum of tension, a silent question hanging heavy in the dusty air, and the unwavering golden stare of a cat who knew far more than he could ever say. Maya reached out, not towards the drawer, but towards the doorway. "Jasper?" she murmured, her voice thin. He met her gaze, his growl subsiding into a tense silence. In his eyes, she saw no comfort now, only a reflection of her own dawning apprehension, and a silent plea, or perhaps a warning. The easy rhythm of their lives had fractured. Something hidden, something potent, had stirred behind a locked drawer. And nothing, not the quiet of the snow, not the warmth of the fire, not the tentative bridge of trust between them, would ever be quite the same again. The question wasn't if she would open the drawer, but how, and what terrifying light it would cast on the mother she thought she knew, and the cat who had become her unexpected, fearful compass. The walls of the little house, once a shelter, now felt like they were closing in, holding their breath, waiting for the lock to turn. The silence in the cottage wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a held breath, a taut wire thrumming with the echo of Jasper's terrified flight, the phantom scent of blood, and the cold, accusing weight of the tiny key, now lying on Maya's scarred kitchen table, gleaming dully under the overhead light. She hadn't slept. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind in the eaves, was Jasper, or the ghost of whatever had attacked him, or the silent scream trapped behind the locked drawer. She paced, listened at windows, called his name softly into the frigid pre-dawn blackness, her voice swallowed whole by the indifferent night. Nothing, only the oppressive silence, and the key. Dawn arrived, gray and grudging. Maya sat slumped at the table, eyes burning, the key clutched so tightly in her fist its teeth bit into her palm. The physical pain was grounding, a counterpoint to the chaos churning inside her. Fear for Jasper warred with a terrifying, morbid curiosity about the drawer. They were intertwined. The lock. Understanding one felt like the only path to finding him, to understanding why he'd been hurt. The fragile trust they'd built, the slow blinks, the tentative paw on her arm, felt like a distant dream shattered by violence and blood. The storm broke mid-morning. Not snow this time, but icy, driving rain, lashing the windows like frantic fingers trying to get in. The wind howled, a banshee wail that perfectly mirrored the desolation in Maya's chest. She'd searched the yard, the overgrown bushes, the rickety shit, calling until her throat was raw. Only the rain answered. He was gone, truly gone. The realization was a physical blow, doubling her over the kitchen sink, dry heaves racking her body. Not again, not again. First her mother, now Jasper, this small, scarred creature who had become her anchor in the storm of grief. Had she driven him away with her obsession? Had it, whatever lurked behind that drawer, come for him? The thoughts spiraled, dark and suffocating. The key burned in her pocket, felt heavy, but pulsing with a malevolent energy. She couldn't leave it, couldn't ignore it. Jasper's terror, his injury, demanded answers. Answers she could only find in that cursed room. Gathering every shred of courage, feeling brittle as old glass, Maya walked down the short hallway. The closed dining room door seemed to loom larger, darker. The gouges Jasper had scratched into the baseboards stared up at her, accusing. She placed her hand on the cold brass knob, took a shuddering breath, and pushed. The room felt different, colder, the air stale and thick, heavy with the dust of disturbed memories. And something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old pennies, that hadn't been there before. Blood? Her stomach lurched. The boxes seemed to huddle closer together, shadows pooling in their corners like spilled ink. The sideboard stood sentinel against the far wall. The crooked bottom drawer, its tiny keyhole, a dark, unblinking eye. Maya approached slowly, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the quiet. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled the key from her pocket, difficult, slick in her trembling fingers. She knelt before the drawer, the worn floorboards digging into her knees. For a long moment, she just stared at the keyhole, the brass pull, the faint scratches on the dark wood. Was this the source of Jasper's agony? Was opening it inviting more darkness in? A gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the window panes. It broke the paralysis. For Jasper, whatever was in here, whatever had terrified him, hurt him, she needed to face it. For him, for the silent bond they'd forged in the firelight. She inserted the key, slid in smoothly, a perfect fit. The faint click of the mechanism releasing echoed in the silent room, loud as a gunshot. Maya froze, holding her breath. Nothing happened. No spectral chill. No sudden apparition. Just the drumming rain and the frantic pounding of her own heart. So, tentatively, she grasped the brass pull, difficult, slightly greasy under her fingers. She pulled. For a heart-stopping second, nothing. With a reluctant, scraping groan, the warped wood yielded. The drawer slid open, revealing its contents inch by agonizing inch. Maya leaned forward, peering into the dim recesses. No hidden jewels. No cryptic maps. No decaying secrets. Just paper, neatly stacked, bordered, filling the drawer almost to the brim. File folders. Envelopes. Thick, official-looking documents bound with rubber bands. Confusion warred with the lingering dread. She reached in, her fingers brushing cold paper. She pulled out the top folder. It was plain, manila, a little dusty. She opened it. Medical bills. Page after page after page. Dates stretching back years. Her mother's name. Procedure codes. Diagnostic terms she didn't fully understand, but recognized the chilling implications of. Oncology. Radiation therapy. Chemotherapy agents. And the numbers. The staggering, impossible numbers. Column after column. Page after page. Deductibles. Treatments not covered. Experimental protocols. Mountains of debt. Maya's breath hitched. She pulled out another folder. More bills. Collection notices. Pleading letters from her mother, written in her familiar, looping script to insurance companies. Detailing symptoms, begging for coverage, explaining financial hardship. The handwriting grew shakier, the tone more desperate, as the dates progressed. A thick bundle of statements from a bank she didn't recognize. Her mother's savings account, drained. Her retirement fund, liquidated. The modest life insurance policy left by Maya's father, gone. All consumed, not by reckless spending, but by the voracious, insatiable maw of illness. The illness she'd only known about for the final 6 weeks. The final layer, beneath the financial ruin, was a single, thin, unmarked envelope. Maya's fingers trembled as she opened it. A letter, in her mother's handwriting, dated just weeks before the diagnosis was shared. "My dearest Maya," it began. The words blurred. Maya sank back onto her heels, the dam inside her finally, irrevocably, breaking. "If you're reading this, the worst has happened, and I wasn't brave enough to tell you face to face. I'm so sorry, my love. I thought I had more time. I thought I could fix it, handle it, spare you this burden. The doctors found something months ago. They called it early stages, manageable. But the costs, Maya, the costs are monstrous. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me as a burden or to sacrifice your own life your future, trying to save mine. I sold the cottage in my heart months ago. It's just paper and debt now. Every penny gone. Fighting this and hiding it from you has been the hardest thing I've ever done. I see the worry in your eyes when you visit, and I lie. I smile. I talk about gardens I'll never plant. Forgive me. My greatest fear wasn't the illness, it was your fear. Your grief. Your financial ruin because of me. I chose to carry this alone. A foolish, prideful choice, perhaps, but made out of love. A mother's desperate, imperfect love. Don't mourn the money. Mourn me, but then live. Live fiercely, my brave girl. That's all I ever wanted for you. All my love, forever. Mum. A raw, guttural sob tore from Maya's throat. It echoed in the small room, bouncing off the towers of boxes holding the tangible remnants of her mother's life. The carefully constructed facade. The vibrant woman pretending everything was fine, crumpled like tissue paper, revealing the terrified, proud, fiercely loving woman beneath, battling a monster, not just in her body, but in mountains of paper debt, and the crushing weight of wanting to protect her child. The loneliness, the fear, the sheer, exhausting effort of that pretense hit Maya with the force of a physical blow. She collapsed forward, forehead pressing against the cold edge of the open drawer, her body racked with heaving sobs. Years of suppressed grief, the fresh wound of her mother's death, the confusing guilt, the terrifying uncertainty of her own future, the crushing weight of this hidden struggle, all erupted. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless, falling onto the medical bills, blurring the terrifying numbers, the desperate pleas. She cried for her mother's secret pain, for the loneliness she'd endured, for the burden she'd shouldered alone. She cried for the lies, beautiful, heartbreaking lies woven out of love. She cried for herself, the daughter kept in the dark, now drowning in the aftermath. The room swam. The boxes blurred into indistinct shapes. The only real things were the cold wood beneath her skin, the smell of dust and old paper, and the torrential downpour of her own unraveling. She didn't know how long she knelt there, lost in the storm of grief and revelation. The rain hammered the roof, a relentless drumming that mirrored the chaos inside. Gradually, exhausted, the sobs subsided into shaky, hitching breaths. Her head pounded. Her eyes felt raw and swollen. The enormity of what she'd discovered, the financial abyss, the depth of her mother's sacrifice, lay before her, a desolate landscape, a sound, almost lost beneath the rain and her own ragged breathing. The soft scratching, not frantic digging, not the terrified scrabbling of the night before. At the back door, Maya's head snapped up, her breath caught. Jasper? Hope, fragile and terrifying, flared in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, legs stiff and trembling, stumbling over the scattered papers. Out of the dining room, down the hall, to the kitchen. She yanked the back door open. There he was, the sudden, bedraggled shadow of himself, caked in mud. One side of his beautiful gray fur matted and dark, dried blood mingling with the dirt. He was shivering violently, his ribs stark against his soaked fur. He stood hunched, shoulders flat, tail tucked tight, but his eyes, those ancient gold eyes, lifted to hers, exhausted, but clear, present, alive. A fresh wave of tears, relief this time, mixed with anguish at his condition, blinded her. "Oh, Jasper," she choked out, her voice thick. He didn't move, just stood there, shivering on the step, the rain plastering his fur down. He looked broken, defeated, so painfully. He took one step forward, over the threshold, then another. He didn't head for food or warmth. He walked with agonizing slowness past her, his wet fur brushing against her leg, leaving a smear of mud. He walked straight down the hall, towards the open door of the dining room. My fault. Heart in her throat. He paused in the doorway, just as he had before. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the open drawer, the papers scattered on the floor around Maya's knees. He saw the medical bills, the letter. His body remained tense, but the frantic terror was gone, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. He took another step, into the room he'd feared. He walked stiffly, favoring his injured side, across the dusty floorboards, towards Maya, who still knelt amidst the wreckage of her mother's secret. He stopped before her, close enough to touch. His golden eyes, deep pools of pain and exhaustion, held hers. He understood. He knew. Whatever he had sensed, whatever had terrified him, wasn't a monster. It was this crushing weight of hidden sorrow, financial despair, a mother's lonely battle. He hadn't been afraid of the drawer. He'd been afraid for her, sensing the vortex of pain it contained, the secret that could shatter her fragile world. So, with immense effort, he lowered his head, not to the papers, but to her knee. He didn't nuzzle. He simply rested his damp, muddy forehead against her, a gesture of utter exhaustion and profound connection. The silent, "I know, I'm here." Maya's hand moved of its own accord. Trembling, she reached out, not flinching from the mud and blood, and gently placed her palm on his wet, shivering back. He didn't startle, didn't pull away. He leaned ever so slightly into the touch. A shudder ran through him, not just from cold. Her fingers brushed the edge of the matted fur, the wound beneath. He flinched, a tiny, involuntary gasp escaping him, but he held still, trusting her, even here, in the heart of the revealed pain. Maya looked down, from Jasper's bowed head resting on her knee, to the damning papers spread on the floor, her mother's final letter, the words blurring through fresh tears. "Don't mourn the money. Mourn me, but then live. Live fiercely." The storm of her tears had passed, leaving behind a strange, hollowed-out calm. The terror was gone, replaced by a vast, aching sorrow, and a dawning, terrible clarity. The mystery was solved, the monster revealed, not a specter, but the crushing, mundane reality of illness and debt, and a mother's fierce, secret love. Jasper, her scarred, wild guardian, had sensed the weight of it, the danger it posed to her fragile peace. He tried to warn her, protect her, in the only ways he knew how, and he'd paid a price. He kept her hand on his back, feeling the rapid, shallow beat of his heart beneath her palm, the tremors that still racked his small frame. The connection between them, tested by fear and violence, felt stronger now, forged in the shared crucible of revealed pain. They knelt together, amidst the scattered evidence of a hidden battle, woman and cat, bound by loss, by survival, and by the quiet, unbreakable thread of understanding, woven in the firelit dark, and proven true in the cold light of a mother's devastating secret. The drawer was open. The truth was out. It was terrifying, heartbreaking, But it was known. And in that knowing, amidst the ruins, leaning into each other, they found the first, trembling, step towards facing it. Together, the silence that settled over the cottage after the storm wasn't the brittle, waiting silence of before, nor the suffocating quiet of deep grief. It was the hushed aftermath, the exhausted calm, following an earthquake that had reshaped the landscape of Maya's world. The fault lines were still raw, visible in the scattered papers on the dining room floor, the muddy, bloody paw prints leading down the hall, and the small, shivering form curled on a nest of towels before the newly lit fire. Jasper slept, a deep, healing sleep born of utter depletion and hard-won safety. Maya had cleaned his wound as best she could, a ragged tear along his flank, deep enough to need stitches, but miraculously missing vital areas. The local vet, summoned in the lull between downpours, had been brisk, kind. "Fight with another animal likely," he'd murmured, his gentle hands probing while Jasper lay limp, eyes half closed in drugged surrender. "A nasty one. He's lucky. Keep him warm, quiet. Antibiotics." The diagnosis was simple, physical, but Maya knew. The fight had been about more than territory. It had been about the oppressive dread radiating from that room, from that drawer. Jasper had sensed the weight, the hidden sorrow, and tried, in his wild, instinctive way, to shield her, to protect her from the vortex of pain he sensed swirling behind that locked door. He'd paid in blood for his loyalty. Sedated, stitched, bandaged, he lay on his side before the hearth, the firelight painting warm highlights on his gray fur, casting deep shadows in the hollows near his ribs. His breathing was shallow but steady, the rise and fall of his bandaged flank a fragile rhythm Maya clung to. She sat beside him, not on the sofa, but on the floor, her back against the worn upholstery. A stack of her mother's papers, the damning evidence of the secret war, sat beside her. She hadn't moved them from the dining room floor yet. Couldn't. They existed in a strange limbo, but not yet integrated into the fabric of her new reality. The initial tsunami of grief, the shock of the financial abyss, had receded, leaving behind a vast, muddy flat of exhaustion and a chilling clarity. The numbers stared up at her, relentless, impersonal, cruel. Her mother, vibrant, stubborn, loving Ellen, had been consumed, not just by cancer, but by the monstrous, grinding machinery of medical debt. She'd fought in silence, sold everything of value, liquidated every safety net, choosing solitude and crushing burden over the perceived shame of being a burden to her daughter. "I didn't want you to see me that way." The words from the letter echoed, a fresh ache beneath Maya's ribs. Such fierce, misguided love. Such devastating pride. Maya traced a trembling finger over a hospital bill, the date stamped just weeks before her mother had finally, reluctantly, called her. "Just a persistent cough, sweetheart. Nothing to fuss over." But, beautifully delivered, with a smile that masked terror and exhaustion. The weight of that deception, the sheer, lonely courage it must have taken, felt heavier than the debt itself. She looked down at Jasper. His ear twitched in sleep, a low, almost inaudible whimper escaping him. Or memory of the fight. She reached out, not touching his wound, but gently resting her fingertips on the unbandaged fur of his shoulder. The coarse warmth was an anchor. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice raspy from tears and lack of sleep. You felt it, that heavy sadness, that fear. That's what you were growling at. Not a ghost, but her ghost. Her secret. Jasper sighed deeply in his sleep, a shudder running through him. He leaned, infinitesimally, into her touch. Confirmation. In the silent language they shared. In the days that followed, moved forward, but it was a life irrevocably altered. The cottage wasn't just her mother's house anymore, filled with echoes. It was a battlefield, scarred by revealed secrets, and a repository of crushing responsibility. It was also, undeniably, Jasper's home now. His presence, his slow, painful recovery, became the focal point, the rhythm around which everything else reluctantly turned. Maya established a new routine, grounded in necessity and the fragile demands of healing. Mornings began not with the heavy weight of grief, but with the immediate physical needs of the cat beside her bed. She'd wake to the soft sound of his breathing, or the faint scrape of his cone collar against the towels she'd layered on the floor next to her mattress. She'd dragged it down from the bedroom, unable to leave him alone at night. She'd administer antibiotics, crushed into a smear of pungent fish paste he reluctantly licked. She'd carefully change the dressing on his flank, her fingers gentle, his body tense but trusting, his golden eyes fixed on her face, watching her every move. He'd flinch when the antiseptic stung, a sharp hiss escaping, but he never lashed out, never tried to flee. He endured her ministrations with a stoic patience, broken only by the slow, deliberate blinks he offered when the worst was over. "I know this hurts. Thank you." The dining room door remained open. Maya couldn't bring herself to close it again. Closing it felt like re-hiding the truth, dishonoring her mother's struggle and Jasper's sacrifice. She walked past it countless times a day. The sight of the open drawer, the sideboard, the stacks of papers she'd eventually gathered into neat, terrifying piles on the table, was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. But it was there. No longer a monster in the dark, but a dragon she had to face in the cold light of day. She started making calls, tentatively at first, her voice shaky, to the hospital billing departments, the collection agencies, her mother's bank. She explained, haltingly, the situation, the death, the hidden diagnosis, the mountain of debt discovered after. The voices on the other end ranged from robotic indifference to weary sympathy, but the message was the same. The debt existed. It was vast. It was attached to the estate, to the cottage, the only asset left. One raw afternoon, rain streaking the windows again, Maya sat at the kitchen table, facing a kind-faced, silver-haired woman named Evelyn from Legal Aid. Evelyn had spread out the papers, her expression grave but not unkind. "The options aren't easy, Maya," she'd said gently, her finger tracing a column of terrifying numbers. "Given the liens, the sheer amount, and the house being the sole significant asset." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Probate, selling, walking away with nothing, or potentially still owing. The cottage, the walls that held her mother's laughter, her own childhood summers, and now, the fragile sanctuary she and Jasper had carved, would likely have to go. To pay the dragon. Maya had nodded, numb. She'd expected it, intellectually, but hearing it spoken aloud, final, official, was a different kind of blow. She'd walked Evelyn to the door, the weight of inevitability settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. She'd stood in the empty hallway, leaning her forehead against the cool wood of the front door, feeling utterly, desolately alone. A soft sound, a shuffle, a faint thump. She turned. Jasper stood at the mouth of the hallway, having painstakingly navigated his way from the living room fire. The plastic cone made him look absurdly vulnerable, like a small, gray satellite dish. He was panting slightly, the effort of the walk clear, but his golden eyes were fixed on her. He took one slow, deliberate step towards her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, looking up, not demanding food or attention, just looking, seeing her, seeing the devastation on her face. He didn't come closer. He didn't meow. He simply sat down, tucking his bandaged flank carefully, his tail curling around his good side. He held her gaze, and then he did it. The slow blink, deliberate, sustained. I see you. You're not alone. The leaden cloak didn't vanish, but it shifted, just a fraction. Maya took a shuddering breath, the first one that didn't feel like swallowing shards of glass since Evelyn left. She didn't move towards him, acknowledging his effort and his pain. She just blinked back, slowly, deliberately. I see you too. Thank you. He held her gaze a moment longer, then lowered his head, resting it on his paws, a silent sentinel in the dim hallway. He wasn't offering solutions. He couldn't fight the dead dragon, but he was there, solid, present, a reminder that even in the bleakest landscapes, connection persisted. Daily life took on a new texture. Meals were no longer solitary, mournful affairs, but shared rituals timed around Jasper's medication. She'd eat her soup at the table. He'd eat his specially softened food from the chipped saucer nearby. Both of them focused, quite, but undeniably together. The sounds changed. The hiss of the radiator was now accompanied by the soft rasp of Jasper's tongue grooming the fur he could reach around his cone, and the low, rumbling purr that started tentatively, then grew stronger as his pain receded and his strength returned. It wasn't the carefree purr of before, but a deeper, more resonant sound, laced with the memory of pain overcome. Maya found herself talking to him, not just about chores, but about the calls, the impossible numbers, her fears. I spoke to the bank again today, she'd murmur, stirring her tea long after the sugar had dissolved. They talked about short sales, deficiency judgments. It sounds like surrender. Jasper, lying in his new favorite spot, a patch of weak afternoon sun near the living room window, would twitch an ear or open one golden eye, giving her that unnerving, ancient stare. He didn't offer advice, but his presence, his steady, silent companionship, was a balm, a reminder that surrender wasn't the only option, even if the only other option was enduring. Nights were different too. She didn't drag her mattress back upstairs. She slept on the sofa, a nest of blankets, Jasper's towels nearby. He no longer needed constant monitoring, but she couldn't bear the thought of him waking in pain, alone in the dark. One night, about a week after the stitches came out, leaving a raw pink line of healing skin, Maya woke to moonlight streaming through the window. The fire had died to embers, painting the room in shades of deep orange and black. She felt movement on the sofa near her feet. Jasper. He was moving, slowly, carefully, up along the cushions, past her knees, her hip, stopping near her waist. He didn't lie down, just looking out at the moonlit room, his profile a sharp silhouette against the glow. He turned his head, looking down at her. Reflecting the embers' glow, shone like molten gold coins. He held her gaze, and then, deliberately, he lowered himself, not onto the cushion beside her, but onto her. Testing her reaction, he stretched out along her side, his body warm, solid, his head resting near her ribcage. A deep, resonant vibration started immediately, thrumming through her bones, filling the quiet room. Maya lay perfectly still, afraid to breathe. This voluntary closeness, to claim it for everything, felt monumental. He wasn't seeking warmth, not primarily. He was seeking her. Connection, comfort. His purr deepened, a sound of profound contentment, of safety restored. Tentatively, tremblingly, Maya lifted her hand. She didn't reach for his head, his vulnerable flank. She simply rested her palm, lightly, on the curve of his back, over his beating heart. He didn't startle, didn't pause his purr. He pressed slightly upwards, into her touch. The sight, deep and satisfied, escaped him. They lay like that, under the watchful moon, in the dying light of the fire. Woman and cat, bound by shared trauma, shared revelation, and the healing that was happening. So imperfectly, but undeniably, in the quiet spaces between the crushing reality of debt and the soft, rumbling affirmation of trust regained. The mystery of the drawer was solved, leaving behind a harsh, unyielding truth. But the mystery of their bond, forged in grief, tested by fear, and strengthened by silent understanding, deepened. It was no longer just companionship, it was kinship. Quiet peck, whispered in slow blinks, the rumble of a purr, and the shared weight of a moonlit vigil against the encroaching dawn of difficult choices. The cottage might be lost, but in this moment, with Jasper's warmth pressed against her side, his heartbeat a steady counterpoint to her own, Maya realized something else had been found. Not a solution, but an anchor, a reason to face the dragon, however terrifying, because she wasn't facing it alone. The path forward was obscured, but they would walk it, side by wounded side. One trembling step, one slow blink, at a time. Spring arrived in Cedar Brook not with a fanfare, but with a weary sigh. The snow receded, revealing mud the color of old bruises and grass flattened by months of white weight. Crocus, tiny and defiant, pushed purple and yellow heads through the damp earth near the cottage's foundation. The air still held a bite, but it carried the faint, green promise of thaw, and the heavy scent of wet soil and decay giving way to life. Inside the cottage, the scent was different. Dust, packing tape, and the faint, lingering aroma of cardboard boxes slowly being filled. The decision, once made, became a relentless current. Selling. The word hung in every room, a silent guest at every meal. Maya moved through the necessary motions. Meetings with the realtor, a weary woman named Brenda with kind eyes and a clipboard. Sorting possessions into stark piles. Keep, sell, donate, trash. Filling boxes with the tangible remnants of her mother's life, now stripped of their hidden, painful context. The dining room, once a chamber of dread, was now just a room, cleared of boxes. The sideboard stood empty, the drawer now permanently open, a gaping mouth that had yielded its terrible truth. It no longer held power, only memory, a heavy, aching memory. Jasper watched. His recovery was nearly complete. The raw scar along his flank had faded to a thin, pink line hidden beneath the regrowth of his storm cloud fur. The cone was gone, replaced by a newfound, almost regal dignity. He moved with his old, fluid grace, but there was a difference. A stillness that wasn't watchfulness, but presence. Deep, abiding presence. He didn't avoid the dining room anymore. He'd walk through it, pausing sometimes by the open sideboard drawer, sniffing the air, his golden gaze thoughtful, distant. Then he'd move on. He followed Maya from room to room as she packed. Not underfoot, but nearby. Perched on a cleared windowsill, watching birds flit in the budding branches. Curled on a stripped bed, observing her fold sweaters with methodical care. He was her shadow, a silent witness to the dismantling of their fragile sanctuary. His calm was almost unnerving. It wasn't indifference. It felt more like acceptance. A quiet understanding that this chapter, this particular shelter, was closing. Maya felt the loss like a physical ache, deeper than the grief for her mother. This house was her mother, the uneven floorboards she'd tripped on as a child, the window seat where she'd read countless summer afternoons, the spot on the kitchen counter where her mother had always left a note. Gone to market. Soup in fridge. Love mum. Packing felt like packing her mother away again, piece by painful piece. The financial reality was a cold, hard stone in her gut. But leaving this, the walls that held echoes of love and laughter, and the silent, shared history forged with jasper in the firelight, that was a different kind of amputation. One rainy afternoon, the kind of rain that wasn't icy, but carried the soft persistence of spring, Maya tackled the last corner of the attic, a space she'd avoided, a jumble of forgotten things too awkward or sentimental for the main living areas. Old suitcases smelling of mildew, a broken rocking horse, Christmas decorations tangled in cobwebs, and a small, cedar hope chest tucked under the eaves, dusted with decades of neglect. Her mother's maiden name was stenciled on the side in faded white paint, Ellen Harper. Maya dragged it out into the dim light of the single attic bulb. It wasn't locked. The hinges groaned in protest as she lifted the lid. Not treasures, but layers of time. Folded quilts, their patterns faded but intricate. A stack of high school yearbooks. Her mother, young and smiling, eyes bright with a future untouched by illness or debt. Bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. At the very bottom, lying flat, a large, stiff envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in a bold, unfamiliar hand. Curiosity, dulled by the weight of packing, flickered. Maya lifted it out. It was heavy, thick. She carried it downstairs, leaving Jasper investigating a dusty spiderweb in the attic corner. She sat at the cleared kitchen table, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the roof. The envelope crackled as she opened it. Not letters, drawings, dozens of them, on thick, slightly textured paper. Some smudged, others startlingly precise. They were sketches of houses, not grand mansions, but small, intimate dwellings. Cottages nestled in woods, cozy cabins overlooking lakes, sunlit bungalows with wide porches, each one rendered with exquisite detail. The grain of imagined wood, the dappled light through drawn trees, the inviting glow of windows. They weren't architectural blueprints. They were homes, filled with a palpable sense of warmth, safety, belonging. Dreams captured in graphite and shadow. Tucked among them, on a smaller sheet, was a note. in her mother's familiar, looping script, but younger, filled with an energy Maya barely recognized. For my dearest Robert, someday, when the dust settles and the world feels less sharp, we'll build one of these. Not a castle, my love, just a shelter, with a hearth big enough for all our dreams. Keep dreaming with me. Your Ellen. Robert, her father, who had died suddenly when Maya was barely 5, leaving behind a young widow and a mountain of grief, and likely debt, Maya realized with a fresh pang. Debt her mother had never spoken of, just absorbed, but alongside her dreams of building a home, Maya traced the lines of a particularly beautiful sketch. A cottage remarkably similar to the one she sat in now, but surrounded by towering pines, a winding path leading to a sun-dappled lake. Her mother's dream. A dream deferred, then shattered. Twice over. First by loss, then by illness. The weight of it, the sheer, quiet tragedy of a life spent holding things together instead of building dreams, pressed down on Maya. Tears welled, hot and silent, falling onto the protective tissue paper covering the drawings. She hadn't known her mother as a dreamer. She'd known her as a rock. Practical, stoic, uncomplaining. These drawings, this note, revealed the young woman beneath, full of hope, artistry, and a fierce, romantic love for Maya's father. The mother she'd mourned had been shaped, hardened, by relentless waves of loss. The locked drawer hadn't just held financial despair. It had held the tombstone of these youthful dreams. A soft thump sounded near her feet. Jasper. He'd come down from the attic. He sat beside her chair, not looking at the drawings, but looking up at her face, wet with tears. He didn't nudge, didn't meow. He simply sat, his presence a quiet question. Maya wiped her eyes, a shaky breath escaping her. "Look, Jasper," she whispered, her voice thick. She lifted one of the drawings, a charming bungalow with a wide porch swing. She dreamed, she really dreamed. Jasper's gaze flicked to the drawing, then back to her. His golden eyes, deep pools of ancient calm, held hers. He didn't understand houses or dreams, but he understood her. Her sorrow, her dawning revelation. He gave a slow blink. "I see you. I'm here." Maya gathered the drawings carefully, holding them like fragile relics. They weren't just sketches. They were a map. A map to the woman her mother was before. Before loss, before burden, before the crushing weight of survival eclipsed the possibility of building. They were a legacy, not of money, but of imagination, resilience, and a capacity for dreaming that not even crushing grief and illness could fully extinguish. She carried them to the mostly empty living room, clearing a space on the dusty mantelpiece above the cold fireplace. She propped up the sketch of the cottage by the lake, the one that resonated most deeply. It looked incongruous there, above the packing boxes, in the hollowed-out room, but it felt a beacon, a reminder. Jasper jumped up onto the armchair, his preferred vantage point. He settled, tucking his paws beneath him, his gaze fixed, not on the sketch, but on Maya. His tail gave a single, deliberate sweep. That night, packing abandoned, Maya sat on the floor near the fireplace. Though no fire burned, Jasper lay beside her, his warmth a familiar comfort against the cool spring air seeping through the old windows. She had the envelope beside her, the note from her mother to her father resting on her knee. Someday, when the dust settles, the dust was settling in the most painful way possible. The cottage would be sold. The debt would be paid. She would walk away with little more than these drawings. A few boxes of keepsakes, and Jasper. But looking at the sketch on the mantel, illuminated by the single lamp, Maya felt a shift. Not a solution, not a reprieve, but a profound, quiet reframing. Her mother hadn't just left her debt and a house. She'd left her this proof of a dreaming heart, this evidence that even in the bleakest times, in the form of a pencil line, a vision of shelter could persist. Jasper, this scarred, silent creature who had found her in her grief, guided her through terror, and anchored her in despair, wasn't just a companion. He was a symbol too, of resilience, of unexpected love found in the ruins, of the quiet, fierce persistence of life and connection, even when foundations crumble. He shifted beside her, stretching out his front legs, his claws gently kneading the worn rug. A low, rumbling purr started deep in his chest, a sound of pure contentment, of being exactly where he chose to be. He looked up at her, his golden eyes catching the lamplight. Deliberately, he lifted a paw, not pointing, not demanding. Gently, ever so gently, tapped the edge of the envelope holding her mother's youthful note. The soft tap. Then he rested his paw back down, his purr deepening. It wasn't a grand gesture, but in that moment, in the quiet of the half-packed house, with the rain whispering against the windows, and the sketch of a dream cottage watching over them, it felt like the final piece clicking into place. The gift wasn't just the drawings, or the revelation of her mother's hidden self. The gift was Jasper himself, his unwavering presence, his silent understanding, his ability to guide her, not just to painful truths, but back to the enduring spark of hope and creativity that had lived within her mother, and perhaps lived within Maya too, buried under layers of grief and responsibility. He'd brought her the key to the drawer, and now, in his own quiet way, he'd pointed her towards the key to her own future. Not a specific house, but the courage to dream of one, to believe. When the dust settled, she too could build a shelter, not just from wood and stone, but from memory, resilience, and the quiet, purring warmth of a second chance, curled trustingly at her side. The cottage would be lost, but the dream, and the cat who guarded it, would remain. That was the final, unforgettable fifth. The last box was taped shut. The sound echoed in the empty living room, a final, hollow period at the end of a sentence written in dust and memory. Maya stood in the center of the space. Her mother's cottage, her cottage for these impossible, transformative months, stripped bare. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, highlighting the ghostly outlines on the walls where pictures had hung, the faint scuff marks on the floorboards from furniture moved a lifetime ago. The air smelled of lemon polish and absence. The realtor's sedan crunched on the gravel driveway. Brenda's cheerful voice carried through the open front door, talking to the movers, the future owners, a young couple with a baby on the way, would arrive soon. They saw potential, space for new memories. Maya saw the imprint of her mother's favorite chair, the faint stain on the kitchen linoleum from a dropped pot of spaghetti when she was 12, the exact spot near the back door where a storm cloud gray cat had first appeared, holding a key that unlocked more than a drawer. Jasper sat on the windowsill in the empty kitchen, his back to the room, gazing out at the overgrown backyard awakening into spring. His posture was regal, utterly still, Sunlight gilded the edges of his fur, catching the faint, silvery trace of his scar. He didn't turn as Maya approached, but his tail gave a single, deliberate flick. Acknowledgement. She knelt beside him, not touching, just sharing the space. The view. The lilac bush by the fence was heavy with fat purple buds, soon to burst. A robin hopped across the damp earth, pulling at a worm. Life, relentless, indifferent, beautiful, carrying on. "It's time," Maya whispered, her voice thick in the quiet. Jasper turned his head then. Slowly, those ancient gold eyes met hers. No fear, no sadness, just a deep, profound calm. He blinked slowly. "I know. I'm ready." He jumped down from the sill, landing silently on the bare floor. He didn't dash for the open door, as he might have months ago. He walked with unhurried grace towards the front of the house, pausing at the threshold of the living room. He looked back at her, not with impatience, but with quiet assurance. "Follow me." Maya took one last look around the kitchen, the empty space where the table had been, where she'd sat with cold tea and a colder heart, waiting for a cat who became her compass, where she'd fed him, tended his wounds, shared her fears in the quiet dark. She touched the doorframe lightly, the silent goodbye, to the walls, to the echoes. She followed Jasper. He led her not straight out the front door, but down the short hallway, pausing before the open doorway of the dining room. The room was empty now, sunlight pooling on the polished floorboards. The sideboard was gone, sold. Only the faintest rectangular shadow on the wall marked where it had stood, where the locked drawer had held its devastating secret. Jasper sat, facing the empty space. His gaze wasn't fearful, but contemplative, respectful. He lowered his head, to slightly, as if bowing to the pain that had been uncovered there, and the love that had hidden it. Turned, and walked calmly towards the front door, and the waiting world beyond. The movers had already loaded the small rental truck. Everything Maya was taking with her fitting easily into its modest space. Her few boxes of clothes, a handful of precious keepsakes, her mother's recipe box, the cedar hope chest filled with quilts, letters, and the large envelope holding the charcoal dreams. And, tucked safely in the cab, a worn, soft-sided carrier. Its door open, Jasper approached the truck, ignoring the movers, ignoring Brenda's cheerful chatter. He paused at the bottom of the ramp leading into the truck's dark interior, sniffing the unfamiliar scents of diesel and canvas. Maya held her breath. Would he balk? Retreat? This was the biggest leap yet. He looked up at her, his golden eyes clear. Without hesitation, he walked up the ramp, into the dimness. He didn't explore the stacked boxes. He walked straight to his carrier, positioned near the front, where he could see out the windshield. He stepped inside, turned around, and sat down, facing forward, his gaze fixed ahead, through the cab window, down the road. A sob, part grief, part overwhelming pride, caught in Maya's throat. This wild creature, this survivor, who had once vanished for months, who had returned holding a key that unlocked her deepest sorrow, was choosing to go with her, not because he was trapped, but because he trusted the journey, and the woman holding the other end of the invisible thread that now bound them. Brenda handed Maya the keys to the truck, and a set of house keys for the new owners. "There you go, honey," she said, her voice softening as she saw Maya's face. "Fresh start." Maya nodded, unable to speak. She shook Brenda's hand, signed the final papers on the hood of the sedan, the scratch of the pen feeling like the last stitch closing a deep wound. She climbed into the truck's cab. The engine rumbled to life, a foreign vibration beneath her. She looked in the rearview mirror. Jasper sat perfectly still in his carrier, watching her. She reached back, her fingers slipping through the mesh door. He pressed his forehead against her fingertips, a warm, solid pressure. The silent, "I'm here. Let's go." She pulled out of the gravel driveway, leaving the cottage on Elm Street shrinking in the rearview mirror. The lilac buds, the mossy back step, the window where she'd watched snow fall, all receding into memory. The ache was deep, a phantom limb pain. But it wasn't the only thing she carried. She drove, not towards the city she'd fled, but north, towards lakes and pines, and the quiet promise of space. She'd rented a small, temporary cabin, a place to breathe, to sort through the practical rubble of her mother's estate, and the emotional blueprint of the charcoal drawings. It wasn't the dream cottage by the lake. Not yet, but it had a hearth, and windows looking out on trees. It was a beginning. After an hour, Jasper made a soft chirping sound. Maya pulled into a roadside rest area overlooking a valley washed in the tender green of new spring. She opened his carrier. He stepped out into the cab, stretched, then hopped gracefully onto the passenger seat. Just gazing out at the vast expanse of land and sky. The wind ruffled his fur through the open window. He didn't try to jump out. He just observed, taking in the immensity, the unfamiliar sense, the open road ahead. Maya watched him, this small, scarred creature, who had appeared out of the twilight holding a mystery, who had become her silent witness, her fierce protector, her unexpected family. He wasn't a pet. He was a fellow traveler, a living testament to the fact that love, true connection, doesn't always arrive with fanfare or in expected forms. It arrives scarred, silent, holding a key you didn't know you needed, leading you through darkness towards a dawn you couldn't imagine alone. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. The wind caught the fur around his face, making him look wild, yet utterly present. He blinked slowly, a deliberate, lingering closure of those ancient golden eyes. Then opened them again. "I see you. We're here." Maya reached out, not to pull him close, but to rest her hand lightly on the seat beside him. An invitation. He considered it. With a small sigh, he shifted, lowering himself, and laid his head on her thigh. The weight, the warmth, the soft rumble of his purr vibrating through her, was an anchor, a promise, a silent poem written in trust and shared survival. Looking out at the valley, the road unwinding before them, Maya understood the meaning, not in grand pronouncements, but in the quiet language of this moment. Grief doesn't vanish. It changes shape, becomes part of the landscape you carry within you. Lost carves hollows, but those hollows can be filled, not by forgetting, but by new forms of love, unexpected, resilient, arriving on silent pause. Second chances aren't about erasing the past, but about finding the courage to turn the key, to open the drawer, to face the monsters of debt or despair or regret, and discover, amidst the ruins, the seeds of a different future. A future where home isn't just four walls, but the space created when one wounded soul chooses to trust another, across the silent inches of a shared hearth, or the open expanse of an unknown road. Jasper's purr deepened, a resonant thrumming in the quiet cab. He wasn't purring for food or comfort, but for the sheer, simple joy of being. And moving forward. Together. The message wasn't shouted. It was whispered in the rhythm of his breath, in the warmth of his head on her leg, in the unwavering golden gaze that had seen her through the darkest nights. Love isn't always loud. It's the quiet persistence of a creature who chooses to stay, who returns holding a key, who faces your monsters beside you, and who blinks slowly, assuring you that even when foundations crumble, the ground, solid, sacred, confirmed, Sharma, one trusting moment at a time, the road stretched ahead, winding through the greening hills, towards the temporary cabin, towards uncertainty, towards possibility. Maya rested her hand lightly on Jasper's head, feeling the softness of his fur, the sturdy curve of his skull beneath. He didn't startle. He pressed upwards, into the touch, the silent conversation, older than words. We are here. We are together. The past is behind us, not gone, but carried. The future is unwritten, but we hold the pen and the key. She took a deep breath, filled with the scent of pine, earth, and the faint, wild fragrance of the cat beside her. She put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. Jasper lifted his head, watching the world flow past the window, his eyes reflecting the limitless sky. A silent sentinel, a quiet guardian, a living reminder that sometimes the most profound rescues are the ones that happen silently, heartbeat by heartbeat, between two souls who find their way home. In each other, the rearview mirror held only the open road behind, and the unwavering golden gaze of the cat who had taught her that even the most broken locks can be opened, and that the greatest keys are often held in the most unexpected paws. Want more heartwarming journeys? Subscribe and hit the bell icon for daily stories that mend the soul. Comment below, what would you do if your cat brought you a mysterious key? Share this with someone who believes in second chances and mysterious cats. Your support helps us tell more unforgettable tales. Until next time, listen for the quiet pause at your due.